Hey, it's Ben and welcome to the podcast. In today's podcast, we are going to go a mile deep on obstacles. Now, if you are trying to create a vision of your future, one of the most likely reasons that you haven't achieved what you've set out to achieve is because there is likely some obstacles that you believe to be in your way. Be them in your external world, that's time, money, resources, etc., or internal obstacles, which we'll talk about in depth today, that are stopping you or blocking you. And in today's podcast, what I want you to take away from is a better understanding of the obstacles that are in your way and ways to overcome them. Now, if there's something I've definitely realized in the space of coaching, is that when somebody gets clear on the obstacle that's in front of them and takes the necessary action, it quickly evaporates. It quickly was just a perception of how they were seeing their world and how they were seeing the obstacles in the way. And, you know, as Ryan Holiday quotes in the fantastic book, "The obstacle is the way. The obstacle in the way becomes the way." And one surefire thing is that you know that you're going in the right direction when you are meeting obstacles along the way. So, as ever, we're doing this podcast to help you with your body, your brain, your business, and your backbone. Knowing the obstacles that lie in your path and meeting them in a non-reactive way where you front up to your challenges with a strong, a soft front and a strong spine is the most important thing I believe to be the biggest part of your leadership possible. Honestly, there's such an important thing. Being able to front up to the hard things in your life, like obstacles, like the hard conversations, like the challenges, the hard times, with a soft front and a strong spine. So you can be both compassionate, you can be sensitive, you can be powerful, and yet you can also be assertive, dominant, and challenging as well. So in this episode, we'll be having a conversation about the two types of obstacles and why it's so important for a leader to have a skill set to discern which type of obstacle they're working with, be it in their own life or that of an employee, a client, a customer, or a partner. And that was a big one for me, is actually working out, what is this? Is this an actual obstacle that is in my way, in my external world, or is this something that's created in my mind to stop me from moving forward, to keep me the safe and sane? So think about this. External obstacles are overcome with strategy, so strategic manipulation of figures, actions, events, behaviors, resources, whereas internal obstacles are overcome by doing the deep work. And this is something I realized over the last 5 years especially, is that I was working with men, so many men would come into the space I'd created and they were struggling with what they believed to be external obstacles, but they're all internal. There was so much worry, concern, anger, rage, hate, self-criticism, self-judgment, that albeit they had a very strategic mind and they were very good at taking action, they were doing all the things that made them a great entrepreneur, what was the bottleneck was the self-work. They hadn't done the deep work. They hadn't ever had a space to talk about the fear, the rage, the pain that they had endured in creating their business, or losing a family member, or going through divorce. And I might have shared this on previous podcasts, is that we didn't really do much strategic work, but yet these men were flying. They were having better relationships, they were having better careers, they were having massive income shifts. And this was largely because they did the deep work. So the obstacles for these men were largely self, not strategic. And so many people I've had to work with and experienced in my work is that they've come to me thinking that I'm going to help them with strategy. Yet, even today, I was on a conversation with a client and we talked about this idea of there being 3 speeds. There's go, there's slow, and there's stop. And trying to share this concept of like stopping with a client who prided herself on being go, go, go. Slowing down was a real step for her. And then it was almost like when the caveman first discovered fire, she was like really thinking, oh, what, there's another gear, there's stop. And she had so much frustration and restriction around just stopping. She was lazy, it was self-indulgent and all these things. But think about this. If I had sat on that coaching call today and created a strategy that had her doing more, that had her hustling, that had her grinding, that had her doing more and more and more stuff, when the fundamental bottom of the pyramid of her health, her mindset, her mental health was created by go, 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 at some point, her body, her mind will just create a circumstance which will cause her to have to stop. And that's actually my belief. You know, my business partner, he said to me, Ben, there's 3 speeds. There's go, there's slow, and there's stop. My body created to stop for me because I wouldn't give it to it naturally. I didn't choose to have that. So it said, right, okay, you haven't listened to me. Here's an illness to go and deal with. And I believe that. I think it's very plausible. And the body's very, very clever of giving you mechanisms to make you stop. Again, in the context of obstacles, is that we have this finite resource, which is, you know, our body, our time, and we've got to manage it effectively. And so we want to start looking at the way that we look at obstacles is internal, external. Internal, we want to be looking at deep work. External, it's about strategy. You might want to write that down because you might have been going in and looking for, and I did this in my 20s actually. I went to every mastermind. I went to so many strategic planning events, and I was looking to solve my personal problems with my business. And it wasn't until I actually got a therapist and started doing self-work and doing much more deep work and going to men's groups and stuff like that, that my life changed. I thought that I would be able to solve personal problems with business breakthroughs and making more money. But all I was doing was loading more money on top of a broken system. So I think I've really lived this experience of making sure that we've got good clarity between self-work, strategic work, and internal and external objects or obstacles. So in this podcast, what we're going to be walking through is what is inner resistance. And there's a concept that I learned from probably one of the most famous psychotherapists in the world, which is Barry Michaels. He's the co-author of The Tools, Coming Alive, with Phil Stutz. And there's a documentary with Phil Stutz on Netflix where he talks about this idea of a part of us, a resistant part of the self, which is there to fuck up your life. You know, I'm not going to hold back with the F-bomb there, because that's its sole purpose. It's there to do the devil's work, to stop you from moving forwards, to keep you safe, the same and small. And if you let that part of you win moment to moment to moment, you will always be thwarted with obstacles. And being very observant of how that shows up for you and in your life, that is when you can start to fight that part of yourself. And it is a fight. It's a daily fight. And I've been in that fight for a long time, and I didn't even realize I was fighting this part of myself until I became very, very clear on how it showed up. I'm going to share some of that with you in today's podcast. We're also going to talk about what are the likely external roadblocks and some of the ways that you can create strategy in order to overcome them. We're going to look at the obstacle statements in the scorecard. And we're also going to look at pragmatic steps where you can get help. At any point, if you are listening to this podcast and you like what you hear, I have a scorecard that goes along with the first 5 episodes where I've given you around about 5 to 7 statements on each of these things, which is vision, obstacles, transformation, implementation, and support. You need those 5 things in place in order to go 10x in your life. And what I've noticed is that one person who is seemingly doing really well will have one area where they can just tweak 1% of their energy and get a big return on their investment. I had a guy fill it in yesterday and actually went through the whole scorecard. He scored really high, and I was like, there's this one thing that stood out like a sore thumb, and I sent him because if you fill it out, I do my absolute best to do a screen flow on every single one of them and send them straight over to you. Do that personally because it's so valuable. And I just go through your results personally. I do it, no one else. It's not a system. It's literally you fill it out. I check your results in my email and I'll do like an overview, which will take you 2 minutes to watch. I'll send it to you. Okay. So if you do that scorecard, which is probably attached to the show notes on this podcast, you'll get even more value from listening to this because it will really immerse you in the podcast and you'll be like, yeah, I can see where I was doing that or why I've been thinking like that. So I'm also going to offer pragmatic steps to get help as well. So let's dive in. What is inner resistance? Well, let me start with one of the best quotes I heard from Barry Michaels, which is the best way to describe inner resistance is actually like spiritual physics and Newton's third law. Now, Newton's third law of motion is every force has an equal and opposing force. Now, if you're a leader, which I'm presuming you are, you're a leader in your family, you're a leader in your business, you're a leader in your relationship, that's probably why you listen to this podcast, is that you have an enormous force for growth. I do. I can acknowledge it in myself. I have an enormous force for changing people's lives. I love creating a ripple. That is why I'm on this earth. I love affecting people and changing the way that they see their life, their world, their business, their relationships, their parenting, everything. I really have a strong force for growth. And you may have that too. Now, here's the thing. If you have this force for growth, you will have an equal and opposing force which is there for destruction. Life is, and the universe and nature creates everything in balance. Now, if this force for growth is met with this destructive force, what is this destructive force? Well, it's the very force that keeps you stuck. It's inner resistance. It's the very obstacle that you probably are most aware of now that I'm mentioning it. It's the voice in your head that says to you in the very moment where you need to be courageous, where you need to be brave, where you need to have that conversation, where you want to move forwards is where you're flooded with excuses, procrastinative actions, things that you get in the way, like thoughts that just won't go out of your head. It could be even you're just about to go on stage to speak in front of hundreds of people and you've got this voice in the back of your head saying, you don't know what you're talking about. Who are you to do this? And trust me, I thought I could outlearn that voice. And the problem being, I couldn't. And I chucked thousands, tens of thousands of pounds, speaker boot camps, speaking coaches. And I thought one day I'd be able to be so well equipped about walking on stage that I wouldn't feel that pain or that struggle, that part X, as we're going to talk about in a second. But what I realized is that part X is actually a compass. It shows up at the very moments where I'm about to grow the most. I'm getting married on Thursday. Part X is absolutely bombarding me with thoughts and beliefs and images and even things that my partner Poppy said. It's holding them in front of me saying, is this a good idea? And it's flooding me with those because I know that getting married is a huge growth for me in relationship. And so what we've got to be really present with is this inner resistance shows up right at the moment we're about to grow the most. So we can use it as a compass. But at the same time, it's painful, it's hard, and it's not obvious on how we actually fight back against part X. And that's why Barry and Phil created what are called the tools. And these are very, very short visualizations which you can use in the moment where you most need to move forwards. And I teach them as part of my courses. I teach them online. You can find me teaching them. If you just write the word "the tools" to me, I'll send you a tool that will help you with fighting your inner demons, your inner enemy. And sometimes this might look like self-destruction, but I'm actually starting to see it more as self-preservation. It's a resistant, almost stubborn part of the self. It's like in the way that it actually stops you from moving forwards is quite icky. It's horrible to deal with. It's often quite painful. it's well documented in the religious texts, self-development books, that inside us we have this resistant force. Like I've read it in different books like the Chimp Paradox and Do the Work. There's also there's so many books which talks about this part of the self, and even Diabolos, which is the devil in religious scriptures. There's this part of us that's there to stop us and do sometimes ridiculous things. And talking to Kristen, my mentor, and I was talking about why is it this part exists, and it's that so many people experience this and they see it as this part. Yeah, it's not well documented. It's like you're not shown how to fight against it. And we were talking about people that are famous, and someone who has got the world at their feet will go and throw it away with some innocuous act where, I think that's the right word, some ridiculous act where they go and do something really stupid. And it seems like it's an act of self-destruction, but it's actually an act of self-preservation, even though it doesn't actually end up being like that. So inner resistance shows up precisely at the moment we're about to move forward. I said that before, and let's get really clear with this. You get a promotion. You get an opportunity to speak on stage. You get an opportunity to go into a relationship. You are about to make a decision about going deeper into a relationship. You have a business idea. And then all of a sudden, wham, there are these different symptoms or these different weapons that your inner enemy will use against you. And this shows up as like hopelessness. I can't ever say that. Hopelessness. That is where we confuse a knockback with a knockout. So this is where you failed 5 years ago, and because you failed 5 years ago, you manufacture that as you're always going to be a failure. So it's confusing defeat and failure. And what Part X is really, really good at doing, it's saying, well, because you failed that one time, you're always going to fail. You're never going to move forward. You're never going to get that result. So why bother? And as long as it can make you believe that, you don't move forwards. So that's an inner resistant part. It's an obstacle. And you've got to see it for what it is. It's just hopelessness. I find that word so hard to say. Then you've got fatigue. Now, the way that fatigue shows up for you as an internal obstacle is you look at your calendar and you tell yourself, I haven't got enough energy to give to that day. I haven't got enough energy to give all of those clients. When that's a lie, because doing the thing gives you energy. You'll probably recognize this most with training. I haven't got enough energy to go to the gym. Because when you go to the gym, you grow. When you've gone to the gym, you've done a gym session, you've never finished the gym session and go, I regret that. And so what Part X does, it tells us that we haven't got enough energy to get through that event in front of us. So then we turn to the outside world, we act on impulse, we look for coffees, we look for stimulants, we look for ways of avoiding things, which exacerbates the fatigue anyway, like sugar and all that sort of stuff. So these all are interlinked as well. You'll notice there's a massive link between all of them. The next one is impulse. And I'm really a real student in not acting upon impulse, because it's really thwarted my life in the past. It's tainted my life in the past. But equally in my most creative moments, like I'll be stood here and ready to film this podcast. And I will be flooded with all these things that I should be doing other than this creative work that's right in front of me. Just before I filmed this podcast, I was scrolling on my phone. I went to go get some chocolate from the cupboard in the kitchen. I was doing anything but moving to the work. And I just caught myself as I was going for the chocolate, like, Ben, this is not doing the thing. Go and do the thing. So you do get better at fighting this part of the self. A lot of men I used to work with would say, I got to go and jerk off. I can't imagine, my brain creates this situation where unless I go and jerk off, unless I have sex, or unless I do something, I can't go and do the thing that's important in my day. And then it pushes that thing that you maybe have in your calendar or that has value off into the distance, and it's less likely to get done. So this is really, it's quite pervasive. It's like when you see it for what it is, it's like, oh my gosh, this is really going on for me. And part of the work I do, especially with one-to-one clients, is helping them label this part. There's two more, which is the victim. It creates this victim narrative that life isn't fair. Life should be fair, and it isn't. And everyone and everything is working against you. Now, I'm probably going to do a podcast on the victim versus owner distinction, but it wants you to think that life is unfair, that you are at the center of a attack from a person, a movement, the government, that life is specifically unfair for you. And the final one is that you hang on to emotions way longer than you need to. So this could be that and I'll just explain my experience of this. I'll be doing the dishes and then I'll be in a happy state, ready to go and maybe do some work or go and spend some time with the kids where my life is going to grow. So investing in my relationship with my kids or with Poppy. And then pop in my head, an old relationship which ended badly comes into my head, and I start creating a narrative around that and reacting to that story in my head at that moment. So I come out of the kitchen and Poppy says, hey, you okay? I'm like, oh, just, yeah. And I'll say something that is maybe reactive or negative or anger driven. And that doesn't help my relationship grow. So Part X shows up in many ways for many people. And it's important to start to recognize how it shows up for you. Why is this an obstacle? Well, the way it manufactures itself as an obstacle is it takes away your attention. Your most valuable asset when you're going through this 10X process is your attention. It's your ability to hold your attention onto something that's valuable, that's going to move you forwards, and to help you keep your attention on something valuable that's going to move you forwards. I learned in my NLP years that your attention is in one of two places, somewhere helpful or not helpful. If your attention is on someone who pissed you off in the past, pornography, getting your next fix of caffeine, scrolling on your phone, if it's your attention's placed there, it's not placed on the thing that's going to grow your life. And Part X is an absolute demon at doing that to you. Or for you, however you want to see that, right? So what happens, what we want to try and do is we want to try and reclaim our state so that we can move forwards and we can move past these obstacles. And this is why inner obstacles are the most, they're the hardest to deal with because they're not physical. They exist in our minds and in our souls, if you wish. And so when I talk about this, and when I started talking about this, I'm a scientist by training. This was very abstract, very woo-woo, but yeah, I understood it because I had lived it for such a long time and it made perfect sense to me. So as we talk about some of these things, it might seem a little bit abstract, but think about what I've talked about. You will definitely acknowledge it to be true. There's some parts of you that have behaved like that in the past. So the way this resistance works, and like I said before, to make sure I get all the information across, is that it's there to steal your state and attention. It steals and weaponizes your attention against you, keeping you from moving forwards. It weaponizes your attention. So the way it weaponizes it, it focuses on something that is what I call catabolic. It doesn't grow you, it shrinks you. So if that's internal resistance, and we call that Part X, what's external resistance? And how do we overcome that? Well, as much as our external world is a projection of our internal world, there may be some real physical roadblocks that are stopping you from moving forwards. Like not everything's just mental, psychological. There might be some real world blocks, like where you live, how much money you earn, resources that you seemingly or don't have or can't see clearly. There may be some restraints on how you can move forwards, and I get that. Even like cultural, working in various countries and various cities, there were restraints on women, and I've moved to Dubai, and you can see that there's cultural restraints on how people, like only the other day I went to a breathwork session and the lady said, oh, by the way, this is a women only space. And I was like, oh, that's really cool, that's really interesting. She said, yeah, because in the past women have never had this kind of space here in Dubai because they just are, it's not cool for them to come and access psychological help. And I was like, wow, that's a genuine external block for women in Dubai to get help for anything that they're struggling with or being challenged by. They're meant to just deal with things within their family and maybe even not deal with them at all, just shut up about them. And I was like, right, okay, I can see that. So there will be some parts that are genuine external resistances and obstacles. So this could be creating time to do deep work. You might be a mother of 2 kids. You might be a father of 5 kids. You might have a relationship where you just haven't got the space in the home to do deep work. It just isn't feasible for you to have that time. So time could be a genuine roadblock for you. You just haven't seen a way to create your day. You might have a 9 to 5. And then outside of that 9 to 5, you've got the kids, you've got your partner, you've got to stay healthy. And then you're like, okay, well, I want to build a business. Where am I going to do that? And that is where you actually need to start getting really strategic. How can you start to build a business with minimal time outside of the 9 to 5? And I've worked with many clients and that has been their goal. I'm in the 9 to 5 trap. I'm really well rewarded for it financially. I just can't seem to be able to create the deep work time to be able to build a business in order to make that jump or that leap. And that could be you. I work with quite a few people like that. So we've got to make sure we're very, very clear on what is internal and external for you. So if you've actually found that helpful, by the way, there is in the school platform. So I've got a school platform called the 10X Tribe. I'll be putting all of the podcast notes. And what I'll do is I'll put the link to the school platform on the show notes as well. So you can come and, as I do these podcasts to help me keep it really valuable, information heavy in terms of what I share with you, but also pragmatic in the steps that you can take. I have a document which I work through as I'm talking, and it helps keep it nice and flowing. But also, if you want that document, just go and head on over to the school platform and you can have it. No problem. Okay, cool. So what we're going to go through now is, now we've got clear on obstacles, and there's 2 types of obstacles, internal and external. We want to go through the statements of the scorecard, and I'm going to give you a bit of an insight on each of them so you understand them better. So I know what my self-sabotaging patterns look like. That is exactly like, do you know your Part X patterns? As you probably heard me talk about before, I know that impulse is one of the ones that I really have to work hard on. So look for, if you don't know what your self-sabotaging patterns and behaviors are, everyone has them. If you don't know what they are, or you say, I don't have self-sabotaging patterns, you're lying to yourself. There will be something small that you can uncover. I'm not trying to give you a problem whether you don't have one. Everyone has these small patterns, whether it's the way they sabotage relationships, whether they hold themselves back, whether it's that one of mine was that I'm not going to tell that story. I used to be very poor at managing detail. And that's one of my self-sabotaging patterns. I'd have a really big opportunity, but because I wouldn't get granular with the detail, I would miss the opportunity. So that's a really important one. The second was, I can deal with haters and doubters. Now, one of the surefire ways to know that you're good at dealing with your own Part X is that when somebody says something that you believe could be true about yourself, you don't get triggered by it. You're accepting of that. When people have made comments about me in the past, I used to get super triggered because I was defending that. Whereas now I'll probably just say, yeah, I can see how you might see that. It doesn't really affect me anymore. And it's a really nice, going back to the soft front and strong spine. That's the soft front. I was like, yeah, I can see how you might see me like that. The strong spine is it doesn't affect me afterwards. And this is my selfish desire for you. If you are good at dealing with haters and doubters, it means that you're going to stay in momentum because you're going to get them. Because when you start taking action and moving forwards in your life, you're going to trigger the people that aren't moving forwards. They're going to project all of their insecurities, all of their deficits onto you and hate you for it. Now, that's just normal and natural human behavior. You've got to be very, very good at dealing with that. But where you start is actually getting present with the hate and the doubt that you give yourself first. Always starts with you first. So I'm going to put here, are you able to see haters and doubters as potential reverse indicators? Actually, like one of the things that an early mentor said to me when I told him about my first ever troll, who he actually got in touch with Tough Mudder and said that I was actually pretending to work on behalf of Tough Mudder. It was like really like just because I used their logo on something, and they sent me a court letter saying cease to trade or cease to promote with this thing I was doing. And it was such it was a mountain out of a molehill. But this guy was a PE teacher who probably wanted to be doing something similar, and he took multiple shots at me across my career. But I could see, looking back, why he might have done that, because he was in pain. So it moves you into a place of compassion instead of a place of judgment, or at least judgment that's not full of toxicity. So I've identified potential roadblocks in my vision, and I've planned how to navigate them. So you might want to write this down. It's the term WHOOP. So wish, outcome, obstacle, and plan. So when you WHOOP a roadblock, you say, this is my wish, this is the outcome I want, this is the first obstacle in my way, and this is the plan to overcome that. So for example, say I've got a wish of building a podcast of 1 million followers. That's the outcome I want. I want to have 1 million followers. The obstacle is my current reach. Well, what's my current plan to overcome the problem with reach? Can use Facebook ads. So it starts to become a way of being where you whoop every single step on your plan. I walk people through this in the 10X Tribe on a regular basis. I deal with stress well. Now, the way that you can tell, like a canary in the mine, for that you don't deal with stress well is that you vape, you overeat, you overconsume alcohol, you have some kind of vice. So if someone tells me that they're great to deal with stress but they're overweight, I disagree. So if you like, let me challenge you from a place of service. If you tell yourself that you deal well with stress, yet you are over fat, I like that term because you have more body fat than is medically determined as healthy, you are lying to yourself, okay? This is true. It's a challenge, and this is an opportunity to really be honest with yourself. If you vape, smoke, or consume in excess, you are doing that from a place of desire to numb, to take away some sort of pain. And that is a coping mechanism. It's it's a coping mechanism. It will help you cope with stress. But what happens is it's short-term empty. It empties the stress bucket short-term, but fills it long-term. So what we want to be able to do is create coping mechanisms and ways of dealing with stress, or removing stress, or not even creating stress in the first place, that don't inhibit your long-term health and performance. So if you want to deal or create a 10x life, you're going to have to create a coping mechanism to deal with the stresses and strains of having a 10x life. And I was actually when I was scrolling before I did this podcast, I was scrolling, I came across Donald Miller, one of my favorite authors. I love Donald Miller's work. You'll hear me reference it a lot on the podcast. I'm going to try and get him on the podcast. Is that he said he was speaking with a billionaire the other day. And this guy, Donald went into the conversation thinking, this guy's a billionaire and he's super calm, he's super collected, he's very curious, he was very present in the conversation, he was in flow. And he was like, yeah, well, of course he's going to be like, he's a billionaire. He doesn't have to worry about money. But then he checked his thoughts and was like, hang on a second, this guy has to deal with so much in order to be a billionaire. He's created that way of being in order to deal with that. Because if he was micromanaging, stressed, overworked, burnt out, toxic about certain people, that would just be amplified with wealth. So as Tony Robbins says this all the time, you get what you are capable of dealing with. And I was like, wow. So you get what you have capacity for. So that's why we want to look at like dealing with stress well. Because when we deal with stress well and we have strategic ways of thinking, we don't have to have the same problems as most people. I reckon 99% of people don't have higher level mind management strategies. I think they just react to things. I come from a very reactive family. It's like, you know, and if you're listening to this podcast, you're thinking the same. It's like, yeah, me too. Feel free to just send me the words me too. It's just like, I love my mum and dad, and I had a great upbringing, but both of them were highly reactive to stress in different ways and to each other. And there was a big part of what I've learned over the last couple of years. It's like, because I came from such a reactive childhood, I have exceptional abilities to deal with stress, like absolutely incredible. And I learned that was one of my master skills. I don't really get fazed by things. Very resilient. So this is the next one. I get up quickly after a knockback. And what this means is when you're a leader, especially, and you take a shot and it doesn't go your way, how do you behave afterwards? Do you lie there and lick your wounds, tell yourself that the world's against you, that you shouldn't get back up, you're a failure, what's the point? Maybe you spend like days, weeks, months, even years, like saying you can't do it. Or do you just see it as, oh, it's a knockback. I get back up, I dust myself down and I carry on. And I want to share with you a win. I was working with a client 2 years ago. We're still working with him now. And when we first started working together, when things didn't go right for him, I wouldn't hear from him for about 6 months. Or maybe not that long, like 6 weeks. That's probably an exaggeration. About 6 weeks, go quiet, not really participating in the conversations we were having. And then we talked about this idea of part X and how a knockback could be made into a complete knockout. And he got it. And then he texted me one day, probably about 4 months after that, where we'd done a bit more work together. And he said, by the way, Ben, just had a massive knockback today. It's 2 hours later and I'm back taking action. He'd quickly overcome an obstacle. And that is the difference between someone who creates momentum and someone who constantly loses momentum. And for me, that was like night and day. That was amazing. I was like, oh my gosh, that was such a big win. And I've watched him create more and more momentum in his life because he's able to overcome knockbacks. So when you can get up quickly after a knockback, you maintain your momentum. And that, like forward motion, when you're creating a goal, a 10x vision, is everything. You do not want to lose your momentum. You want to be like, okay, dust yourself off, get back on the horse. And like even when my kids are learning to ride a bike or go on the scooter, if they fall off, the first thing I'm going to do is like, okay, get really positive mindset, get them on, acknowledge that it hurt a bit, brush them off. Okay, off you go again. I don't get all sad and make sure that I just get them back on doing the thing that they're already doing. And that's how they've learned at such a young age to ride bikes, ride scooters, etc., etc. So we're trying to maintain momentum. The next one on the scorecard is I'm good at knowing how I'm getting in my own way. And this is, if you haven't had coaching before, if you haven't had someone listen to you for a prolonged period of time and then hold a mirror to you, this is likely one of the struggles that you're having. You don't know how you get in your own way. You might assume that you know. There's nothing like having a third party say, hi, by the way, this is what I can see. I've been very, very fortunate to have some of the best coaches in the world. One of the guys I believe to be one of the best coaches in the world tell me exactly what he saw without any like holding back. Like, this is what I can see. It was incredibly painful when I first got into the coaching, but then I just saw it as pure love and service. And I think about you as a leader. Are you able to comment on your staff, your customer, the person that you're working with, and make observations of service to them? There's a book by Kim Scott called Radical Candor, and it's this idea of caring so much that you're willing to challenge. So it's called Care Personally, Challenge Directly. Instead of ruinous empathy, it's like, oh my gosh, I care about them so much, I'm not going to say anything. But that allows them to perpetuate. Well, getting good at knowing when you're in your way needs a third party to often give you that challenge and that feedback. And that's why coaching is so beneficial. Because often it's us that we need to be clear about how we get in our own way, so then we can see it in others as well, especially within a place of leadership. So one way you could actually be getting in your own way is goals that are way too big goals that are really big, but then also the steps are way too big. That's what I see quite often in people that get in their own way. I've got this big goal of, a couple of million, or want to 10x the business, but the first rung on the ladder is way too big. They try and go way too fast, way too soon, and they burn out, and they continue. They never really get into the journey because they keep burning out at the start. The only thing I can share with the metaphor for that is that in my running journey, I really wanted to get to a certain pace. So I started out way too fast, and I'd get injured, and I'd always get injured when I knew it was going to be the long game which was going to get me to that pace. And it's only in slowing down and taking smaller steps that I've managed to get more and more momentum towards my goal, which I still haven't got yet, but stay tuned in the podcast. I'll keep updating you. So getting clear on how you get in your own way allows you to win the war on the inner enemy, because you get to see potential roadblocks and navigate them strategically with best placed time, effort, therapy, support, whatever you need. And the last two, I have reactive discipline. So as I talked about before, most people react to circumstance. So when something shows up in their external world, they react to it. Instead of creating their response, they react with a program that's been there since childhood. And the book you need to read if you really want to understand this is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Now, what reactive discipline really means, in essence, is in any given set of circumstances, I get to choose my own attitude. Now, what I think this means is that, say your boss comes in and is really mean and nasty every single day. In the moment, it's going to hurt, and it's okay to feel that hurt. But then it's our choice, it's our attitude, what we do with that afterwards. Do we transform it into a boundary or a way we need to communicate? Is it that, do we change that into something that's meaningful for us, that's going to help us move forwards? Or do we see it as purely destructive? Now, what we've got to be able to do is make a decision on how we are going to use the things, the struggles, the challenges in our lives. And we have the discipline to respond to events instead of react to them. And what this means, it's the ability to experience pain, but choose not to suffer. Reactive discipline is creating your state through intentional thinking, vision, and action. And the final one on the scorecard is I am able to spot the next obstacle in my personal roadmap. Because what we often do is that when we get over one obstacle, that we believe sometimes that there's going to be no more obstacles. And it's almost like, actually, sometimes strategic thinking is saying, well, actually, I've overcome this. What's the next problem? And sometimes, and this is something that Dusan talks about, is like, it's the next problem. We want to be solving the next problem. Circle people who kind of go in circles and never really move forwards. They love solving the same problems because they're often scared of the next problem. So, for example, filling my gym was the first problem that I solved in my business. Then it was upping my fees. Well, if I didn't want to up my fees, what I would constantly do is find ways to empty and fill my gym and pretend that's the problem that I had to solve. So upping my fees might have been a way harder thing for me to do emotionally than to fill my gym and refill my gym. So we've always got to look for what's the next problem or the better problem that we want to be solving. So there's the statements in the scorecard. So hopefully that's giving you a bigger and better context of what is why these are obstacles, why they're in your way. And if you've got a low obstacle score, hopefully this is giving you somewhere to start. Now, what we want to look at is how do you overcome obstacles? Well, like I've said, strategic planning It's actually sitting down and working out how you're going to overcome the time constraints, the energy constraints, the financial constraints, and getting support with that. The other way that you might want to do this is actually by doing deep work. A lot of the obstacles I've probably talked about today, I can imagine, if you're like most of the clients I work with, are internal obstacles. They're probably part X. I would say that if you could remove this 30 to 40% restrictive thinking and you applied that as propulsion instead of a brake, imagine how fast you would travel and how much momentum you would create. So this is where my prescription for this is learn how to spot part X and use tools to stay in momentum and stay in forward motion, and also have a space in your calendar where you can planning and execute at the same time. So if you are listening to this podcast and you want that space to overcome some of the obstacles and get around people doing the same thing as you, feel free to come on to one of the workshops that I'm running. I run every 3 weeks. I do a free workshop. It's 3 hours. It's an investment of your time. And I will help you create a 10x vision. And we can look at some of the obstacles that might come up as you are writing that 10x vision out. Equally, if you found this really helpful and you've listened to the Vision podcast, you now listen to the Obstacle podcast, I'd invite you to listen to the next podcast where we're going to go and start talking about 10x transformation. When we start looking at transformation, a lot of the obstacles that we might have created in our mind thinking 2x will be eliminated when we start thinking 10x, because we have to think about these things differently. We have to be better, we have to be more effective, and we have to do less. And what you'll find is sometimes that the external obstacles that you might be, like time, effort, energy, like money, they actually will disappear when you think way bigger. And it sounds crazy, but listen to the next podcast and I'll tell you how. Thank you so much for listening in, and I'll see you on the next podcast.